Iran had just pushed the Strait of Hormuz into crisis, and the move was already starting to backfire. Around 400 large cargo ships were stranded off Oman, oil prices were climbing, and the energy risk was no longer staying in the Gulf. Tehran wanted leverage. What it got was a larger crisis, a wider response, and the first signs that this move could close in on Iran itself. Hormuz is not powerful for its size, but for its geometry. A narrow strip of water can become a global pressure point when the entire energy economies are built around it. LNG cargoes, refinery feedstock, and stable insurance costs. In 2024, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates sent nearly all Persian Gulf LNG flows through the same corridor. In 2025, over 110 BCM of LNG passed through the Strait of Hormuz, equal to nearly 1/5 of global LNG trade. Once that route is threatened, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It moves into utility bills, power markets, industrial costs, and inflation expectations across continents. Reuters reported that most ships remained stuck even after a handful of gas tankers began testing limited passage, and the article described a bottleneck severe enough to leave around 20,000 crew members stranded in the Gulf. The disruption was already putting the system under real strain. Europe was facing another energy shock, and Asia was hit even harder because most crude moving through Hormuz goes east. Singapore's foreign minister warned the region was facing a severe crisis as the conflict disrupted a major share of global oil and LNG flows. Iran wanted leverage. It created alarm on a scale that large import economies were never going to absorb passively. The first move did more than disrupt shipping. It internationalized the war before the next military phase had fully started. The opening shock at Hormuz rattled markets. The strike on Ras Laffan changed ownership of the crisis. Once the world's largest LNG complex took a direct hit, major economies were suddenly facing higher gas prices, higher oil prices, higher freight costs, and higher insurance risk. A strike on Ras Laffan hit one of the anchors of global LNG trade. Reuters reported that Iranian strikes damaged 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG trains and 1 gas-to-liquids facility, cutting about 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity for an estimated 3 to 5 years. Qatar Energy Chief Saad Al-Kaabi put the annual revenue loss at about $20 billion. Energy importers could now see the war hitting their own fuel supply, not just another target in the Gulf. The impact hit Europe fast. Reuters reported that natural gas prices surged by as much as 35% after the attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure. Europe only takes part of its LNG directly from Qatar, but that still leaves it exposed. Once Qatari cargoes become scarce, Europe is forced into tougher competition with Asian buyers for spot LNG. Costs rise across the chain, and governments with vulnerable power systems start reassessing how much instability in the Gulf they can tolerate. Japan felt the pressure immediately, and so did the rest of Asia's import-heavy economies. What had looked like a contained exchange of strikes was now turning into a direct threat to regional energy security. These countries had no interest in being dragged into a Gulf war, but even less interest in letting Tehran keep squeezing their fuel supply, industrial output, and shipping costs. By March 19, that hesitation was fading fast. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan issued a joint statement condemning the attacks, backing efforts to stabilize energy markets, and supporting safe passage through Hormuz. After Ras Laffan was hit, governments were no longer watching this from the outside. The war was now reaching into their own energy systems, reserves, and economies. A shipping shock had now drawn in 22 countries with different militaries, different legal constraints, and different appetites for risk, but the same exposure to a prolonged Hormuz disruption. Iran was no longer pressuring a single opponent. It was turning multiple import powers against itself. That shift is the center of gravity in this story. Country coalition turned market fear into coordinated power. It includes NATO states along with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. A hybrid force ready to send naval assets, anti-submarine systems, and autonomous platforms into Hormuz. Once that many countries start treating the strait as one shared problem, Iran has less room to use it as leverage. was always likely to be at the center of any coalition response. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says that in 2024, about 84% of the crude oil and condensate and 83% of the LNG moving through Hormuz went to Asian markets. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the biggest destination countries. Reuters reported on March 24 that Japan was preparing its biggest ever release from national oil reserves after already drawing down private reserves and joining the broader emergency response. For Asia, this was now a direct supply emergency. Washington pushed that alignment forward, especially with Japan. Japan was too exposed to sit back while Hormuz was under threat. Whether the figure was around 90% or closer to the high 80s depending on the measure, the point was the same. Japan and the broader East Asian import bloc could not treat Hormuz as someone else's naval problem. The route sat too close to their energy supply. This coalition did not come together out of solidarity. Too many countries depended on Hormuz staying open. Tehran tried to use the choke point as leverage. Instead, it pushed multiple import powers in the same direction. Once 22 countries were moving in the same direction, the focus shifted to execution. The coalition still had to reopen Hormuz without sliding into a drawn-out naval fight. That is why the plan was built in 4 phases. It was not just a show of force, it was a step-by-step operation. Mine clearance had to come first. Sea mines were still Iran's cheapest and most disruptive naval weapon. It was not enough to declare the shipping lane open. The water had to be made safe enough for commercial traffic again, using mine hunters, unmanned underwater vehicles, and specially equipped helicopters. Reuters reported on March 23 that Iran's Defense Council warned any attack on its southern coast or islands would trigger mine laying and a full Gulf closure. That made the opening phase even more urgent. Before tankers could return at scale, the lane had to be shown to be clear of ambush risk. Escorted shipping came next. This was not a new idea. During Operation Earnest Will, the United States escorted Kuwaiti oil tankers through Gulf waters during the Tanker War. It ran from the 24th of July 1987 to the 26th of September 1988, and the U.S. Navy later called it the largest naval convoy operation since World War II. The lesson was straightforward. Merchant traffic does not come back just because a navy says the route is open. It comes back when shippers believe convoys, patrol patterns, and rules of engagement can keep losses under control. Aerial patrol and coastal surveillance came next. Then came direct strikes on Iran's coastal attack systems. The mission had moved beyond just protecting traffic in the strait. It was now about reducing Iran's ability to rebuild the threat. That meant targeting coastal missiles, drone launch sites, fast boat movements, missile batteries, drone bases, and coastal shelters. A third U.S. aircraft carrier, 2,500 Marines, and even discussion of a possible ground move against Karg Island all pointed in the same direction. This was getting bigger. Reuters described Karg on March 14 as Iran's key oil export hub, handling about 90% of its crude exports before recent strikes. Once Karg entered the planning picture, the campaign was not just about reopening the lane, it was also about putting Iran's own export lifeline at risk. This 4-phase plan does not describe a fleet waiting offshore. It describes a coalition shrinking Iran's room to operate from the sea lane to the coastline behind it. By this stage, the campaign had moved beyond the strait itself. Tehran had tried to weaponize energy panic. The response was to blunt the panic, cap the price shock, and widen pressure on the institutions carrying the war. That is where the 400 million barrel release comes in. Reuters reported that the International Energy Agency moved 400 million barrels from global reserves after the wave of attacks on major Gulf energy infrastructure. Another Reuters report described Brent moving back toward $100 a barrel as reserve releases and limited transits through Hormuz began cooling some of the worst panic. The price was still high. The direction was what mattered. The coalition was proving it could answer disruption with volume, coordination, and alternative routing rather than simply absorbing the shock Tehran wanted to impose. The source text adds a second layer to that market response. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline is described as operating at full capacity, with coalition countries pressing producers for more output and trying to push oil back below $100. At the same time, the battlefield picture had already turned hard against Iran's naval doctrine. The text says Iran's mine-laying capacity had already been reduced by 90% and that more than 130 Iranian vessels had been sunk. Those numbers are severe because they describe a force losing its cheapest strategic tools while the market it hoped to shock is being reinforced from outside. Pressure also moved onto the legal and financial map. On the 19th of February 2026, the Council of the European Union formally added the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to the EU terrorist list. The official EU announcement says the designation triggers asset freezes and a ban on making funds or economic resources available to the organization. The source text pushes that pressure wider, describing more than 33 countries moving against IRGC networks, front companies, cargo channels, business visas, and banking access. Tehran wanted Hormuz to become a lever. It was turning Hormuz into a trigger for its own financial suffocation. What remains to Tehran is not a winning naval campaign. It is a smaller and more dangerous menu of asymmetric disruption. The source text reduces those remaining options to 3 cards. First, covert mining with Qatar mini-submarines and civilian-looking fishing craft. Second, anti-ship missile attacks from concealed coastal terrain using Noor and Kausar systems. Third, pressure through the Houthis, pushing risk back into the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb in order to split attention and firepower. Reuters reported on March 23 that Iran warned any attack on its southern coast or islands would lead to mine laying and a full Gulf closure. That fits the first card exactly. These are tools of cost imposition, not tools of reversal. They can raise insurance, they can delay shipping, they can produce one more week of fear on trading desks. They do not reopen strategic space once 22 countries are aligned around keeping Hormuz open and stabilizing energy markets. Reuters reported on March 23 that Bahrain had taken a draft UN Security Council resolution to New York seeking authorization for force to protect shipping in Hormuz, while China and Russia were expected to resist. Even that tells its own story. Moscow and Beijing may object. They are not breaking the maritime pressure building around Iran. That matches the wider picture in the source text. China is exposed. Russia is constrained by Ukraine and limited to restricted satellite intelligence behind the scenes. Syria and North Korea are silent. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates are described as siding with the coalition against regional chaos. The so-called axis of resistance looks much smaller when confronted with a real multinational fleet at the mouth of the Gulf. That is the final conclusion. Iran tried to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a weapon. It turned the strait into a magnet for outside power. It tried to force the world to absorb a shock. It forced the world to organize against it. Tehran can still make the system flinch. It cannot make the system yield.